Okay, here we go. So this is going to be the first of a series of application development workshops to help you think through the different components of your application, better position you in terms of specificity and clarity of what you're proposing, and make sure that you have as cohesive a narrative as possible. As I mentioned during the info session, the kind of work that you'll be doing in this by putting together this application is so translatable and valuable for other kinds of spaces. So everything I'm about to tell you right now is something that can be thought of for other kind of like, if you're going to graduate school applications, this is certainly important. For jobs, certainly important to help you think through that specificity and the clarity of the vision. Because in order for people to want to, offer an opportunity to you, whether that's kind of like, a fellowship like this or, place in a graduate program or a job, they have to want to be invested in what you're offering and be excited by the focus that you bring to the table. So that's what we're going to be trying to do throughout this workshop. So the problem, the issue. So critical to any fellowship application is the sense of what you are committed to working on. We need to have a sense of what your focus area is. And so this gets into like the differences between the larger problems and the issues. We need to help you find out and identify what your particular issue is. Because if you have two candidates and one candidate says, oh, I'm interested in climate change, and you're like, okay, great. And then the other candidate says, I'm interested in thinking about how do we monitor and track instances of kind of like environmental risk in order to mitigate those, like, so flooding, for instance, and perhaps like South Asia. I'm interested in seeing like, how do we best monitor and track those kinds of like incidents of climate change in order to mitigate that. I would be much more convinced and interested in that second candidate because I have a much better sense of kind of the issue in which they're focused and what they hope to do about it. So the problems are like those larger kind of amorphous, larger challenges that you alone could never hope to fix them. Some people might think that they could, alone fix the problem, but you cannot. I mean, even people who've been working in that field for decades, this is not something they could address. Like poverty is another kind of like these like larger amorphous problems. The issue is something that is specific within that larger problem that you could do something about. And so the emphasis on that is the practicality of making a difference. What is something that you could address in the future in a particular kind of space, in a particular kind of capacity? So I have some examples here. So like, once again, I mentioned like the problem of poverty. An issue, a particular like one branch of that someone might focus on would be perhaps like the lack of adequate housing in inner cities, or like the problem of like the global food crisis and insecurity. The issue might be the development of biotech that gene splices crops to help them withstand drought and flood. Or like the problem of climate change, as I mentioned, an issue within that might be like regulation of deforestation practices. I want to emphasize here, because now you might be thinking like, oh my gosh, like there's so many things I'm interested in. How on earth could I like pick, I'm interested in climate change. How on earth could I get down to like a specific of deforestation? Like that may be disingenuous to say like that is my particular issue when I have like this range of issues. That doesn't matter. I mean, so to reassure you, a fellowship application is not a contract. And indeed, like anything, an application to graduate school is not a contract. I mean, you should have a particular focus area, but it's understandable that might change and might evolve. And these fellowships are not looking for someone who's static. They understand that like, as you continue to do this work, your particular like issue area might evolve and might go in a slightly different direction. That's completely fine. But for the purpose of an application, you need to have that anchor, that kind of like that issue area that helps us understand what you are committed to what you're committed to do, and what you hope to do about it. So keeping that in mind. Okay, so how do you determine what your particular issue is? So you consider the roots, and this comes down to your experiences, the perspective and expertise that you've gained from your experiences. So it's going to be important to take stock of your coursework to date. What have you done in the classroom? What research experiences have you had? What kind of like extracurriculars have you been engaged with? And what perhaps is something that you've engaged with in multiple spaces that is something that you've been particularly excited by? So within your courses, what have been the issues that you have wanted to find out more about, that perhaps you wrote some papers on? Outside of the classroom, what kind of organizations or clubs are you in? What kind of internships have you had? What might be like a common thread in those? And this is not to say that all of your experiences should have been oriented around a particular kind of topic, because very rarely would that have happened. But what is kind of like a question or kind of like a larger issue area that you've come to engage with in some way in at least a few different kinds of capacities? So this is going to require a good amount of reflection, kind of like just like noting down like things that you've done, noting out what has been particularly important to you about those different kinds of experiences, and seeing like what are the kinds of themes that seem to emerge from those kinds of experiences. And then taking stock of those perhaps like themes or those kinds of topics that you've engaged with, think about which one are you most excited by as a potential future career? What do you think is significant and urgent? What do you hope to be working on? What is the kind of topic where, well, you're no longer kind of on campus in like the dining hall, but what would be the topic that if you were back on in the dining hall would have been excited to share with your friends about like things that you were learning or doing? So that becomes your starting point. Okay. When we think about how this problem or like the issue, I would just kind of distinguish between the problem and the issue, how this issue manifests itself in your application, it should be something that is significant and urgent, because if something is significant and urgent, we are more inspired to want to support your candidacy because we want someone who's going to be who's committed to working on that significant, urgent issue and understands the nature of that issue. And we're also looking for people who have a potential to be a leader on that issue, once again, in the future, as evidenced by the ways in which you've engaged with that before. So if you have two candidates, to like give you another example, if you have two candidates going back to the climate change example, and someone's like, climate change is going to be like the number one most pressing issue of our time in the coming decades, but they haven't at all engaged with different kind of like having engaged with environmental studies, haven't done anything related to the climate in their past experiences, coursework, internships, extracurriculars, what have you, I'm not going to be convinced as a reviewer of that application that person has that longstanding commitment to work on that issue and that they're well positioned to begin thinking about it. If, however, I had a candidate who, once again, is interested in climate policy, has perhaps been involved in green, has like maybe done like the, what is that called? Like the modules that are the interdisciplinary modules around climate change. Like perhaps I see that person has been engaged in that way. That kind of case for that issue is going to make a lot more sense to me as a reviewer, and I'm going to be much more likely to support that person's candidacy. And I emphasized thinking about how you've engaged with an issue in different spaces, because I think the most interesting kind of candidacies are those that have gained those different kinds of dimensions or gained more than one dimension or perspective on that issue, that issue has been something that they've thought about in more than just say like a few courses, but it's something perhaps they either have like had an internship around or have devoted some extracurriculars to thinking about those kinds of issues. So I think the multiple spaces helps convince a reviewer that this is a longer standing commitment and that you've had the opportunity to think in more creative and multidimensional ways about that issue. Okay. So things to avoid moving forward is talking about yourself as a sole practitioner, because in order for an issue to be significant and urgent, it is inherently kind of complex. And it is something that you alone could not hope to solve. And when we say that Truman is looking for people who are going to be change makers in their respective fields, we're not looking for people who have the hubris to say, I am going to be the one who solves every dimension of like food insecurity. Like that is obviously not happening. We're looking for people who understand how to pragmatically make a difference, who are aiming high, have great aspirations, but understand kind of the limitations, the kind of space in which they might be able to work on this issue. And so I think thus are thinking in bold ways, but also realistic ways about how do you affect change in that respective space. So we're not looking for people who are going to claim that they are, going to solve all these issues alone, that perhaps experts have spent decades trying to think through the immense complexities of those particular issues. Okay, and this gets into the second thing is the language of solutions. In your Truman application, you are not telling the reader that you've solved climate change or figured out how we as a planet can eliminate the global warming. Yeah, you do not have solutions at this point. You are too early in your academic professional career to have solutions. So your task is rather to help the reader understand that you understand the challenges around that issue, and have had to grapple with that in different spaces, and now are seeking to pursue a different path that will enable you to think about how to effectively intervene or effectively make change in that space. Also avoiding underestimating the issue. As I said, these issues are going to be all the issues that I use as examples are all inherently complex. So you have to recognize and be realistic about the challenges that do exist. And the other thing is avoiding choosing an issue that is much too broad. Like something about, let's see, what would be an example of this? Like saying we need to rethink diplomacy. I don't even know where to go, think about what that means. So you need to have something that's kind of concrete, where we understand and you understand also, in what spaces would someone be working on that issue? How do people go about working on that issue? So you're not throwing something out that's so amorphous that as a reviewer or a reader, I don't really know exactly what you were doing and what you want to do. Does that make sense? Everyone has thumbs up? You don't have to do thumbs up. Okay, we're all good. Okay. So next steps, developing the trajectory. And so as you may know, if you've already kind of looked at the sample application that I sent, there are going to be several aspects of the application that get into this area of the issue and then also the trajectory. I think question 9 is the problem or need of society that you wish to address. And then Truman also asks you to talk about your short-term and your long-term goals. So those are 3 questions of the, maybe 8 more substantive questions that Truman asks. So you need to think about, and this is the reflection piece again, what have you done about it? As I said, reflecting on the different ways in which you might have engaged with this issue in some way. What will you do about it? As in, what is the kind of work? What is the kind of graduate work that you hope to do? So I guess both academically and professionally, what do you hope to do to gain additional expertise and skills to be in a position to affect change in that issue area? And then how will the Truman Scholarship, in this case, assist you in doing more about it in the future? So kind of charting out these different steps. And this is actually great work, guys. As I said at the beginning, the work that you'd be doing for this is so translatable to other spaces, because I can't tell you the number of times where someone has told me, who's been applying to the Truman, that in the process kind of charting out this trajectory, they've received so much or gotten so much more clarity about how do you even go about doing this kind of work? What kind of graduate programs would be appropriate for someone who wants to do this kind of work? So these would be the things that you would be thinking through in preparing your Truman application. Okay. So as I keep mentioning, the specificity and clarity of this vision is so key. So something to understand is that you don't have to completely invent something from the ground up in terms of what this future might look like, because there are organizations and individuals that have been working on these issues already. So a great place to start is Googling. And this, I find this fun work, but maybe this is just me as a fellowship advisor, but hopefully you will too, is starting to think about, okay, what agencies, offices, bureaus, organizations are currently engaged in this kind of work. So, what if you were interested in eliminating the school to prison pipeline, thinking about, okay, what different kinds of organizations already do this work? Like maybe, Department of Education is interested in this in some ways. There are nonprofit organizations that are certainly interested in these kinds of issues. So starting to research what is the range of organizations, agencies that engage with this issue in some way, reading about what those different entities do, looking at bios of people who work at those kinds of organizations or agencies, and thinking about which of these paths most resonates with me. Like, what am I most interested in? Does this person's job sound cool? does this person's kind of background, is that in line with something that I would be interested in doing? So once again, you don't have to invent kind of like this career path. These kinds of career paths already exist. And thinking about who might serve as kind of like that model for you, and not to say you exactly copy that person's bio, but it can serve as a blueprint for thinking about, okay, so this person did graduate work in, I don't know, they did a master's in public health at this kind of institution. And then they went on to work for Department of Health for this state government. And then they went on to this. And this is the kind of position I would ultimately hope to have. So by doing this kind of work, you are going to give yourself that scaffold that is going to enable you to show that you have a realistic sense of how to get to where you want to go, and is also going to help you be so much more specific about what each of those kinds of steps of your career look like. So I would say this in addition to doing the reflection, the reflective work about what are the issues that you've engaged with already, this also work of thinking about, okay, what does that look like in the future is so important. So you're doing both the work of looking at the future, the far future, and also looking at the past. So doing the forward and backward looking kind of work at the same time. Also, by looking at those models of people who are doing the work that you find fascinating, you'll see what are the kinds of trends and innovations in this field? What are people doing? And the reason I say this is important is because, as you may know, for Truman, you do have to write a policy statement. So for the policy statement, it's helpful to know what are people already doing. You don't want to just kind of repeat something that has been well established, has already been happening for decades. But thinking about, is this office developing this new kind of initiative that actually might be something that you could implement in your home state in some capacity? So it will give you ideas perhaps for kinds of policies that you might adapt, kind of rethink, repackage for how it might be implemented in the kind of different space or in a different geographic location. And that's completely fine. As I mentioned in the info session, you don't have to come up with a brand new policy. Some of the most effective policy statements are those that are saying, in Pennsylvania, the Department of Health tried out this initiative. And I'm in New Jersey, and I see, given the kind of context here, the possibility of adopting a similar kind of program and implementing it in this kind of capacity, because that's going to show that you understand what's happening in the field. You have an understanding of who are the people who are doing this work. So you were already going to do so much of the legwork or groundwork for your application, and doing this kind of thinking about what that future vision might look like. So once again, this gets into what type of leader do you hope to be, and what types of interventions do you hope to make? Okay, so this all comes down to the puzzle pieces here: assessing and revisiting fit. You might, on that kind of work of doing the reflection about what are the different kinds of issues that I engage with, charting those out, thinking about, okay, what are those kinds of career paths, and doing a constant assessing and matching thing. Because if, as you were doing your research into kind of future kind of careers, positions, organizations, and you find you thought you were going to be interested in one kind of career path, but then you found this other person who's doing amazing work that you're so excited by, but that person pursued a different kind of path or graduate study, had a slightly different background, that may cause you to kind of rethink maybe your graduate school plan, and to make sure that all those pieces are in line. So it's constantly thinking about like, how do these puzzle pieces fit together? And then also thinking, this gets into the recommenders piece, thinking about what are the three people who are best positioned to speak in enthusiastic detail about you, given the kind of narrative and through line you're going with in your application. I should mention, this is not to say that all your recommenders have seen you or engaged with you in the kind of issue area that you've identified for your application. But it might help you strategically think through how to narrow it down of like perhaps like recommender options. And certainly as you are kind of charting out this future path and thinking about how your past experiences have prepared you for that future path, you definitely want to keep your recommenders updated, because that ensures that you are getting a stronger letter of recommendation, that it's not just like a template letter like, oh yeah, Laura was a great student, contributed in the classroom, wonderful. But saying like, you know, Laura's experience working in this kind of capacity, or my observations of Laura in the classroom in terms of how she contributed to particular discussions around like climate policy, assures me of her like strength of purpose when it comes to this particular career path. That's going to be a much stronger letter. So you are helping recommenders by giving them that information. I know sometimes people get concerned about like overwhelming recommenders with information. I don't think you can ever provide recommenders with too much information. People love information. So this is only a good thing. Also, I should note now, as I'm thinking about the recommender situation, other common issues that arise where people say, I've already asked a recommender to write for me for like internships, and I don't want to ask the same person again because I'm nervous I'm asking them too many times. Okay, number one, it is the job of professors to write letters of recommendation. So this is part of their professional path. You should never be concerned about asking a faculty member for a letter of recommendation. This is what they are paid to do. I mean, among other things, but this is one of the things. Also, people who've already written a letter of recommendation for you can easily adapt the letter of recommendation to another context. So keeping that in mind too. So ultimately, you always want the people who are going to write in the most enthusiastic detail about you to be writing for you. Okay. Moving on. So do we have any questions? I should pause here. You can chat like in the chat box if you have any questions about this that I can answer before we move into talking about examples of what this looks like in the Truman application. Any questions? We're all good? Okay. Oh, let's see here. Okay. Do the policy proposal and the issue have to be exactly related? Yes. They need to be related. What did I just do with my thing here? Shit, what's going on? They need to be related because the policy statement, the policy proposal, is an opportunity to show how you were thinking about interventions around the issue that you've identified that you want to work on. It's an opportunity to showcase like that, you know, once again, how to potentially affect change in that issue area. What are the kind of spaces that you might hope to be operating in the future? So like those pieces are certainly very related. You wouldn't want to say that your issue area is something related to like, you know, food deserts, and then your policy statement is about, I don't know, like something pertaining to climate policy. That would be like, it would give the reviewer whiplash. So the things I'm talking about, yeah, I should clarify, the things that I'm talking about right now, what this impacts in the application is the problem or needs of society that you wish to address question, the kind of graduate work question, because we need to know what kind of what graduate work is in line with the future goals, the short-term goals, the long-term goals, and then the policy statement. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. You can always feel free to chat them and I can answer them later as well. So I want to show you a couple of examples of that question of what is the problem or needs of society that you wish to address, which is like, I think it's question 9. So I'm just going to read this to you and then we're going to reflect on this. So the old saying goes that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Yet many Americans in low-income neighborhoods do not have access to that apple. In 2018, the Bureau of Economic Research released a study detailing that 24% of zip codes are food deserts and have no grocery stores within the zip code. Even more telling is that 55% of zip codes with median incomes below $25,000 contain no grocery stores. The differential access to groceries is correlated with varied consumption of healthy food. Households with incomes lower than 70,000 are less likely to maintain a diet that meets USDA nutritional recommendations. Poor people are eating 1 gram less of fiber per 1,000 calories and 3.5 grams of sugar per 1,000 calories. The direct result of these consumption differences is an increased risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Each 1 additional gram of fiber consumed is associated with a 9.4% decreased risk of diabetes, and each 3.5 grams fewer of sugar consumed is associated with a 10% decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. In sum, poor people are more likely to die of preventable disease simply because they are poor. The Bureau's research indicates that a lack of nutritional education further compounds these issues, suggesting that education-based interventions are also critical to reduce nutritional inequality. In my career, I hope to dismantle structural health inequalities caused by poverty and improve health on a population level. Okay, I would love to know anything that struck you about this example. You can either chat it or you can like unmute yourself. Just kind of curious, like what you thought was really great about this, or kind of what struck you about this example. Would love to reflect on this. Any thoughts?
I think it's the statistics are like really helps the application in that like you're showing that you understand the issue and also that like it is an issue.
Yeah, I think it's great. Because I think with all these statistics, the statistics, as you said, it shows this person has a deep understanding of what the kind of issue area is with regards to like nutritional, like kind of nutrition and kind of like health inequalities. But also it's helping the reader through using the statistics understand the magnitude of the problem. Because without the statistics, we would be like, oh yeah, it's a problem, but are we just taking your word for it? Like, what is there to kind of evidence the ways in which this is a significant problem? Anything else that people liked or were struck by, maybe confused by? Okay, I'll let you send that. We'll go to the next one, maybe and talk about that one too. Okay, so number 2. The image of the refugee as a figure constrained to life in a camp is one of undeniable emotive power, but is unrepresentative of the global refugee population. In fact, 60% of the world's 25 million refugees live in urban areas where their rights are far from guaranteed, and the economic stress of displacement often sparks tensions in refugee hosting countries. Urban refugees face barriers to employment, financial credit, courts, and education, while host governments must work rapidly to accommodate new arrivals. As one example, a recent study of Lebanon showed that its 1.5 million urban refugees now represent 30% of the country's population, with 76% of displaced Syrians living under the poverty line. This demographic change has increased Lebanese water demand by 12% and electricity needs by 447 megawatts, while rising rental costs have left more than 500,000 refugees with insecure housing. From Somalis in Kenya to Venezuelans in Colombia, the ripple effects of migration extend beyond the refugee camp and into municipalities, where both displaced and host communities are at risk of social immobility. There is no universal solution to improve the lives of those who flee to escape conflict and disaster. However, I hope to move beyond the paradigm of a refugee crisis to create multilateral policy solutions that equitably address this issue in the world's urban centers. So once again, we have the statistics that you mentioned. Good amount of statistics that kind of underscore the magnitude of the problem. Anything else? Guys, there's no wrong answers here. This is just reflections.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Like, are these like basically the introductions to like someone's application, or like how specific should you get near the end with like the conclusions and stuff? That was my question.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm going to show you guys the actual application to show you what this looks like in the application. So let me pull that up. Here we go. And then I'll go back to the deck. Let's see here. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so this is the Truman application that you are going to be completing. The examples that I just provided are going to come up here. Question number 9, describe the problem or needs of society you want to address when you enter public service. If possible, use statistical data to define the magnitude of the problem. So doing this work is directly applicable to the application. This is what the application is asking for. So this is a critical aspect of the application, because as I said, it serves as the anchor for the rest of it. Everything should be oriented around the issue that you wish to address. Because as I said, to I think the other question about like, should this problem or needs society you wish to address be related to the policy statement? Yes, like there needs to be that sense of cohesion. We don't want to get whiplash. That sounds like you were, oh, I'm interested in like food insecurity, but I'm also interested in educational equity, and I'm also interested in something. Like, no, we need to have a sense of like what the issue area is, how you've engaged with it, how you envision yourself working on it in the future, and what kind of graduate program will help you, enable you to do that. So these examples I'm showing you are, I mean, those went through a lot of work. I'm not going to say that, like those were their first drafts. Those are probably like 10 drafts in of like what that statement looks like. But that one's going to appear as question 9. And then the other kind of questions that what I've been speaking about relates to is like the graduate education program you intend to pursue. That's question 11. Question 12, what do you hope to do and what position do you hope to have upon completing your graduate studies? Question 13, what do you hope to do and what position do you hope to have 5 to 7 years later? So all these pieces are going to hinge on what the issue is that you choose to confront. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let me go back then to the application. So yes, the 2 that I'm showing you are kind of like the final drafts, but like you should be striving for this level of specificity in your own application. Okay. Okay. So once again, the statistics we have. So this leads into what are the kinds of components that are central to coming up with a really strong and compelling problem or issue of society you wish to address. So first, we need a clear definition of the issue. As I said, these people are not saying like, oh, I hope to like reform diplomacy, and I like have no clue what reform diplomacy means. These people have a clear, like the clear issue that they're working on. Here we have like urban refugee policy, because as we've learned, like millions of refugees live in these kinds of urban settings, when we think in fact like it's more refugee camp type of issue. And then here we have like access to nutritional foods, like with food deserts being one of the central problems, which increases kind of social disparities and inequities. So clear definition of the issue. We have the specific data and data sources. As you can see, yeah, both used the specific data. They had the kind of the sources from where they were drawing this information. The Bureau of Economic Research here. And then we have all of these sources here. So go to the data, go to the evidence is important. And then also a sense of what the candidate hopes to do. So with the first one, in my career, I hope to dismantle structural health inequalities caused by poverty and improve health on a population level. So leading into where this is taking that person. And then here, hope to move beyond the paradigm of refugee crisis to create multilateral policy solutions that equitably address this issue in the world's urban centers. Now, you don't have to get too specific with what you intend to do at the end of the problem or needs of society question. It's more so just to kind of like set it up, indicate like this is the direction I'm headed. And then those later questions that I showed you in the application, the short-term goals and then the like more longer-term goals, that's where you get into the specifics of what actually you intend to be doing. Like, what is the space, what is the office organization in which you hope to be working, and what kind of role do you hope to hold within that organization? Okay, so do not be afraid of that level of specificity. You can never get too specific. You don't have to say like, I'm going to be vice president of this particular organization, but like, I hope to hold a position like blah, blah, blah at that organization. Like that helps. Okay. I don't know if you've seen this, but the Truman, let me just, oops. Oh, now I'm just on, okay. If we go to the, Truman website, they actually have the questions that I drew from are ones that I've worked on with candidates, but here they actually provide more both satisfactory responses and tell you like why they find them satisfactory, and they also give you unsatisfactory responses so you can see like the kind of pitfalls to avoid here. Like unsatisfactory responses, we have to fulfill our promised vision of equal opportunity for all citizens. Government is responsible to its citizens. Government is the great actor by which social improvement is achieved. Okay, so this is like super broad. We know this person's like generally interested in like domestic violence issues, but there's like no real sense of, you know, the kind of magnitude of the problem, the statistics here, or what they intend to do about it. Yeah, this is like really not a great line. I always known that I want to help people. I mean, kind of like the baseline here is that if you're applying a Truman Scholarship, you should have some interest in the social good, the public good, and helping people. So these are the kinds of things to avoid the kind of really vague cliche. Let's also avoid cliches. We don't need cliches. Also a good test for just life is if you can read something you wrote and anyone else could have written the exact same thing, you know you need to get more specific. Okay. So you don't need to like wax poetic about like how public service is an amazing thing. We need to like know what your issue areas within that. So you can also spend some time reading these. I think it will also be helpful to kind of give you a sense of what you need to be striving for in your own response. And they actually have samples for other kinds of questions too. So it's not just question 9, but since we're on question 9, I wanted to show that to you. Okay. I think that was the end. Yeah, that's the end of what I wanted to discuss here. I would also mention that we do, and I think I showed this in the info session, but our website, gofar.georgetown.edu, we do have a fellowship applicant toolkit that provides some additional support in terms of like how you actually craft it. This one, Truman doesn't really have more of a standard personal statement, but some of these might be helpful. Definitely the guide to supporting recommenders, which I think I linked to in our last email. Assembling your team, who do you turn to for what? I think sometimes there's a fear of not asking for help sometimes when you are preparing an application like this. But keeping in mind that, you know, you have different individuals in your corner who want to support you. Obviously, our office is here to support you kind of preparing the application, but also like perhaps like thinking through your issue area, faculty with whom you've worked or taken courses with, you know, talking to them about your interests and seeing if they have kinds of suggestions of things perhaps you should be reading or might consult to help you think through kind of the specificity of your issue. So also wanted to mention this to remind you that those resources exist. So now I just turn it over to see if you have any questions that I can answer while we're here. Future workshops, I'll focus on kind of like the leadership piece, the public service piece, and maybe some like the other additional components of the application. But any questions about what we've discussed? Yeah, Daniela, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. I just had a question about like also can you hear me? Because I know I'm like wearing my mask.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks. Like what, like I don't even know how to ask the question, like where, because I don't know if I should be focused, like for my issue area, do we, like, is there a region, like, I don't know how to ask a question, like if it's a federal based thing versus a state based thing versus a local based thing versus even a city based thing, does that matter?
That's a good question. So Truman doesn't care if you hope to work domestically, if you hope to work internationally, if you hope to work at the state level or the federal level, that doesn't matter to Truman. What matters to Truman is just that you seek to go into public service and are going to, like, you know, have a career at, like, you know, a government organization, educational organization, nonprofit organization, one of those. So that doesn't matter. So it could be like, you could be focused on more like domestic concerns or the international concerns. For the problem or needs of society that you wish to address question, I would be careful of getting too granular to the fact that, like, in the city of Baltimore, this is happening, because you're almost constraining yourself too much. Like, so if you were interested in kind of like educational equity and you're from Baltimore and you're interested in like that in Baltimore, I would focus the problem or needs society that wish to address question more in like educational equity in the United States, getting into like, you know, the gaps or like how certain kinds of school districts are funded more than others. And like, perhaps like that's kind of like what you want to be addressing. And then your policy statement could be on the more granular level of like within Baltimore public schools, I'm going to be writing my policy intervention statement to the superintendent to like how they could implement this kind of program that would improve like support and resources for kind of like lower income and first generation students or something. So I wouldn't get too granular in the problem or needs of society question. Certainly in the policy statement, that's an opportunity to get like go really local. And actually oftentimes I find that I'm encouraging people to go more kind of like local with the policy statement, because I think it grounds it a bit more. I think sometimes like trying to do a federal, like some kind of like federal intervention becomes a little bit more tricky perhaps. I mean, it's certainly doable and people have done it. But sometimes like the policy intervention can be really effective when it's like a little bit more kind of like that, like state level or perhaps like local level of how this might be accomplished.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
I also had kind of a more general question about the application process. Like, how do you have any tips or recommendations on like how we can balance like thinking about these things and like putting in the effort and time to like write and like look through all the resources, and also kind of like our general just like class load, like workload, and also just like extracurriculars we're in?
Yeah. I mean, to be fully transparent, like, and as you probably know, like fellowships like this take a good amount of time. I mean, like in order to do it well, I mean, you could probably certainly like throw it together like the night before. I never recommend doing things like that. But they do take a good amount of time to put in the kind of reflection and work that's going to make sure that it is kind of polished and kind of a accurate and strong reflection of what you want to do. So keeping in mind that the internal deadline is October 26th, I should mention that if you do receive endorsement, there are like 2 more months that go into working on your application. So this is definitely like a work in progress, but you want what you submit by the October 26th deadline to be in a polished state, because this is how our Truman selection committee is kind of making the decisions of who to put forward. So in terms of like how to kind of divide up the time, or like, I guess we have like just over 4 weeks now before the internal deadline, I would suggest spending this next week really kind of defining the issue. Because I think like sometimes there's a tendency like to want to jump and like do the kind of like biographical pieces or maybe like a leadership piece. But because you do want to have that cohesive like through line for your application, identifying that issue, once you identify the issue, the other kinds of pieces fall into place, because the issue is going to help you think about like, okay, what are the future goals look like? That's going to help you do those pieces. It's going to help you, once you think about future goals, think about like, okay, what does the graduate education people have to achieve those future goals, and help you then identify the graduate program. Once you have those pieces, then you step back and think about, okay, what is the kind of perspective that I need to have as someone who's working in this space? So perhaps it's like the challenges of liaising between competing priorities and needs. And then you might think about, okay, I have this leadership example. Think about like, okay, how do I, through talking about this leadership example, perhaps like speak to the kind of mindset or perspective that's going to be valuable to the work that I want to do. So like everything really falls into place once you have like this part of the application kind of set. So this next week, certainly spending some time thinking about the issue area, beginning to like read around that issue area, think about what that looks like, begin kind of like Googling what that future kind of career might look like, thinking about that match, as I said, between those future goals and what you've done, because you want to make sure you have had some sort of experience engaging with that to assure the committee that this is like kind of a viable option for you. So using the next week to like kind of think through those pieces, then reflect on the leadership and public service examples that are going to be, I think, your strongest examples. Think about how they loop into this. And then begin kind of drafting those pieces later on. I will say that you can ask recommenders now and say, like, ask them if they think they might be able to write a strong letter for you, given like this is what you're applying to do. If they say yes, you can say, thank you so much. I'm currently working on drafting my application. As soon as I have a working draft of blah, 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 I will send it to you for your reference. So you can kind of like make sure these kinds of like initial pieces are all kind of there. And then, in a couple weeks, begin like really seriously drafting some of these other pieces of the application, and then send those to your recommenders when you have them. Okay. Okay. Emily, you want to jump in with your question?
Yeah, sure. So like my question is, I don't know, this is kind of like, I don't think really applies to anyone else, but so I took like a medical leave of absence in fall 2019. So like I am not like set to graduate until
how about I think you and I think someone else have a specific question. I will answer those questions. Hang on, and then I'll come back to those. I just want to make sure.
All good. Yeah.
The ones. Natalie, did you have a question that might be applicable to everybody?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the original info session, but I was just wondering, how many people does Georgetown nominate?
7, 4 non-transfer students and 3 transfer students.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.